Hello, and welcome to the Observations podcast, hosted by Democracy Volunteers. I'm Matt Davis, Special International Elections Correspondent for the Observations podcast. Today, we'll be talking about a country that has some upcoming elections, a country that you might know nothing about. Today, we'll be discussing Suriname. You're probably wondering, where is Suriname? Well, Suriname is a country the size of England on the north coast of South America, with a population of a little over 600,000 people, meaning it has roughly the same population size as Glasgow. Also, it's the only South American country not to border a Spanish-speaking country. So there's something to remember if that ever comes up in a pub quiz. But who might you know from Suriname? Some famous Surinamese people include Jimmy Floyd Hasselbank, who played for Leeds United between 1997 and 1999, and played for Chelsea between 2000 and 2004. And Anthony Nestor, the first black swimmer to win a gold medal in the Olympics during the 1988 Olympics in Seoul. Suriname has a National Assembly of 51 members, which are elected every 5 years by a regional proportional voting system. It has a semi-presidential system where the largest party can elect a president with a two-thirds majority. If no candidate receives a two-thirds majority after 2 rounds of voting in the National Assembly, a United People's Assembly, consisting of representatives from national, regional, and local councils, convenes to choose the president by a simple majority. It has a multi-party system, which means often parties will have to form coalitions in order to govern. Now, Suriname has a legacy not dissimilar to those of Commonwealth countries, which now have English as their first language. However, Suriname was a Dutch territory, meaning now about 60% of its population speak Dutch. It received its independence in 1975 and now has key exports of gold, precious metals, refined petroleum, rough wood, and bananas. These links to the Netherlands are why we have the Dutch University of Leiden's leading authority on the show. So for this episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Wouter Veenendaal, a researcher who has looked at the politics of small-scale democracies and how a country's small population size can have an impact on its politics. As part of this research, Wouter has looked into the politics and political history of Suriname. But before we get into the interview, we'll first have a short commercial break.
Did you know, at the last UK general election, Democracy Volunteers observed in over 200 Westminster constituencies, the largest domestic election observation in British electoral history? You can find out more about the findings at democracyvolunteers.org.
Welcome back. So first of all, Wouter, welcome. It's lovely to have you on. How this will work is we'll look into how Suriname's politics functions and some of the issues that arise during its elections. So to get us started, what can you tell us about Suriname and its elections?
Suriname is a former Dutch colony located in South America geographically, but culturally part of the Caribbean. And it became independent from the Netherlands in 1975. Then, relatively quickly after independence, 5 years after independence, there was a military coup. And then for 8 years, Suriname had a military dictatorship under the leadership of Desi Bouterse. And then in the early 1990s, late 1980s, the country transitioned back to a democratic system modeled on the Dutch political institutions. And basically, what you see is that after that, at elections, there has been a power struggle between the party of the former military dictator, Desi Bouterse, who passed away last year, and the democratic, you can say, opposition, even though Bouterse's party also transitioned to a democratic political party.
Okay, so obviously you've mentioned the colonial links there. Suriname doesn't have an embassy in London, but it does in the Netherlands. Does it maintain strong links with the Netherlands at the moment?
Absolutely. Yeah. So even though the country is independent, what you realize when you visit Suriname is that it still remains very much focused on the Netherlands. Dutch news is being shown on television channels. People speak Dutch, so the language is also very important. And I would say that the links with other Latin American or Caribbean countries are relatively weak. So you still notice that despite the fact that this year the country is independent for 50 years, still remains very much focused on the Netherlands. And that's
Hmm.
also because there is a very large Surinamese diaspora in the Netherlands. So many people have family in the Netherlands. Approximately half of all Surinamese people actually live in the Netherlands.
Hmm. Oh wow, that's yeah. I didn't know that. That's quite interesting. So you've mentioned a bit about the troubled history with democracy that Suriname has had. Could you tell us a bit more about that and potentially how Wouter has had kind of ongoing influence since the dictatorship?
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, Suriname had a military dictatorship in the 1980s. In the end, that came to a close because, similarly to other Latin American countries, there was a wave of democratization that swept essentially the entire continent. So, Suriname was part of that transition. Bouterse wanted to remain very much involved in politics, and one of the main reasons for that is that he wanted to avoid prosecution for the killings that happened under his regime and also the cocaine smuggling in which he was involved. So that is seen as one of the reasons why he established a political party, the National Democratic Party, or the Purple Party as it is known in Suriname, and wanted to compete in elections, and also decided in 2010 that he wanted to become the president himself because then he could also become immune for political persecution. And he also wanted to have a law passed through parliament that would give him amnesty for the crimes committed during his regime. And basically, his party is a populist party that very much appeals to the poorer segments of Surinamese society. There are also some ethnic differences with the other parties that we can talk about. But that's
Hmm.
basically the main opposition, I would say, in Surinamese politics between that party, which is a party of the masses, but also a populist party, and the traditionally more ethnically oriented other parties.
Okay, yes, yeah. So I think that kind of leads on to the next question about, let's say, how politics, I suppose, in Suriname works. And you were talking about how a large number of the parties cater to a lot of specific ethnic groups in the country. Now, from my understanding, Suriname's quite an ethnically diverse country. But how does that work in terms of political representation?
Yeah, that's definitely true. And I would say that's the driving force of Surinamese politics. So it's a very diverse country, which is also historical or colonial legacy, because as a result of transatlantic slavery, many people of African descent came to Suriname. Then many people from British East India came in the late 19th century. And after that, people from the Dutch East Indies, so Javanese population. So it's
Hmm.
very diverse. And political parties have formed when they were organized for the first time in the 1940s around these ethnicities. And still, many of the Surinamese political parties catered, in, as you say, to one specific ethnic group. So that remains very important. And it's quite interesting that as a result of that, Suriname has a tradition of consensus coalition governments,
Hmm.
forming coalitions between parties representing the different ethnic groups.
Hmm. Okay. Um, so why do these upcoming elections matter to Suriname, the Netherlands, and the wider world then?
I think the most important reason is that is the discovery of large oil fields just off
Mm,
the coast of Suriname. A similar thing has happened in neighboring Guyana, former British colony, and it's generally believed that that discovery can have a major impact for Suriname in terms of economic development. So what you notice in comparison to past elections is that at these elections more is at stake because the parties really want to make sure that they can control the state apparatus and also to be able to distribute that oil money among their supporters or the segments of the population, ethnic groups,
mm.
perhaps that support them. So for that reason, these elections are really, really important for Suriname.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. So I suppose for the 2020 elections, you wrote that Bouterse's shadow loomed over Suriname, despite him not being elected at that time. Do you think his legacy still like hangs over this election?
Yeah, so of course he passed away in the
Mm,
meantime a year ago. So what has happened is that this purple party that I talked about before, the populist NDP, is a party that was very much established as a political vehicle for Bouterse himself. So it was a very personalized party in support of one leader, Bouterse.
Hmm.
And perhaps unsurprisingly, what has happened is that after his death, there has been a power struggle for control over the party. And that struggle in the end was won by Jennifer Simons, is a former Speaker of the Parliament.
Mhm.
And she is now the first female candidate also for the presidency of Suriname. But her position is quite weak because of all the infighting that has happened within this party. So the current government of Suriname is quite unpopular. Everybody believed that this party, the Purple Party, would have a chance to win the elections because of that, because it's currently the opposition party. But the infighting has weakened the position of that party and of their presidential candidate.
Okay. So I suppose if you were to make predictions, you wouldn't expect them to do certainly as well as they have done, say, 10 years ago in these upcoming elections.
Yeah, it's difficult to predict because
Hmm.
not a lot of opinion polls are being held in Suriname. But the one reliable opinion poll that I did see indeed didn't show the Purple Party winning the election, whereas that is what you would expect after, the current government being very unpopular in office. And the main reason for that, I think, is this infighting. So what I now saw is that actually the party that's currently the largest, that's the Orange Party. Um, the Progressive Reform Party, I think, would be the English translation, but that's a party that traditionally caters to the Hindustani, so East Indian voters.
Hmm.
That, according to this opinion poll, was still the largest in the poll, which surprised me because the party's been really unpopular in government.
Hmm. Okay. I know some of your research talks about kind of how population size of a country impacts how it functions as a democracy, and Suriname is quite a small population. Um, what impacts do you think that has on how Suriname functions as a democracy?
Yeah, so I think that doesn't go just for Suriname, but basically for all small states and islands in the
Hmm.
Caribbean, but also other parts of the world. What I've noticed in my research is that politics in small societies focuses very much on personal differences and personal relations, and much less on programmatic or ideological forms of competition. Also, that there is a tendency towards clientelism, which is also really important in the Surinamese context. So that means that people vote for a politician and expect material benefits or favors in return. Is very important in the Surinamese context, in particular in relation to different ethnic groups and their
Hmm.
representation. And finally, in small societies, there's also a natural tendency towards power concentration. Also, the case in Suriname. So, the fact that power tends to be concentrated in the hands of the government, whereas other institutions such as parliament, the media, or the judiciary tend to be relatively weak. And within the government, then power is concentrated in the hands of just one, two, or three powerful players who, in the case of Suriname, have been politically active for decades on end.
Hmm. Okay. How does so much power concentrate around such small numbers of people when typically there's a lot of coalition building that has to go on for a government to form?
Yeah, that's true. So this coalition building very much depends on the personal relations between politicians, and that is, I would say, a downside of the proportional electoral system that Suriname has. So what always end up with a multi-party system in which parties need to form coalitions, but that coalition forming process is very opaque to voters. They have no idea which party is going to end up in coalition with another one because ideology doesn't matter. So it all is about how the different personalities relate to each other, but also what agreements they can make about how state resources are being distributed among voters and how posts within the government are being allocated. So that is very important. But what you can also see is that some people who might have had a very bad relationship for a long period of time, then can suddenly, form a coalition together because on a personal level they manage to iron out the differences between them. So it's also at this point really hard for me to predict. I can predict that no party will win a majority, but it's really hard to predict what government will come out of these elections because that's a very black box kind of process.
Right. So yeah, I suppose on that side of things, the election's only the first part, and then you have this coalition building that's, I suppose, a different, almost its own part of the democratic process.
Yeah,
there.
and what is really important in the process is also very important to keep in mind is that Suriname has a very odd political system in a way in which the president is elected by parliament. So there is basically a second election taking place in which the members of parliament, the newly elected parliament, need to vote for a president, and president can only be elected if he or she obtains 2/3 of the votes of the members of parliament. And if that doesn't happen, it will go to another institute, which is called the United People's Assembly, that also includes all subnational politicians in Suriname.
Hmm.
But in any case, that election of the president is really important because to be elected, a party already needs to form a coalition with other parties that will support their presidential candidate. So that's where you see kind of the negotiations already taking place.
Okay, so have there been kind of informal coalitions forming over the election period already then?
At this moment, not so much.
Hmm.
I think what you do notice is that for parties, for the different political parties, it's really important to be part of that government because they also need to show to their supporters that they are able to obtain this position that will also allow them to distribute favors and services to their voters. So that's why it's really important for political parties to be part of the government, even if it needs to be with parties that they or political leaders that they have hated for a very long period of time.
Okay, yeah. So we're coming towards the end of the questions I think that I've got already, but is there anything that we haven't really touched on in these questions that you think would be quite important for our listeners to know, to have an understanding of Suriname and of its elections and how that all functions?
That's a good question. We already talked about the unique
Mm.
kind of system that Suriname has with a president who is directly elected from the parliament. That the same thing happens, or that system is basically modeled after South Africa, which is very interesting because that's the only other country in the world that has this kind of indirect election of a president by parliament. And I think it gives a very specific twist to Surinamese politics because the position of the president in Suriname, the powers that the president has, are not very clearly defined in the constitution. And what you've noticed over the past decades is that some presidents behave basically as prime ministers in a parliamentary system, whereas other presidents take on a more presidential role like presidents in a presidential system. And precisely because Suriname is a hybrid in which the powers of the president are not constitutionally defined very clearly, that
Mm.
also allows different persons to fill in this role differently.
Okay, yeah. The lack of specific like sets out for what powers I suppose the executive has, unlike say America, which has its defined constitution, leaves more room to kind of have very different styles of presidency. Then,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah,
Although I would say that the current American president clearly
that's
oversteps on some of the powers that he has according to the Constitution. But yes.
yeah. There's definitely things to say about how effective a written constitution can be,
Yeah. Yeah.
but yeah, are there any kind of examples of I don't know one type of president being more prime ministerial and kind of choosing to align with their party slash coalition, and the other one taking on more executive power?
Yeah, so I would say that the presidents of the parties that are currently in the government, so basically the traditional ethnic parties, their presidents have usually operated more in a kind of parliamentary, prime ministerial role. But that's also a result of the fact that these were coalitions. So the leader of the government couldn't function too much as a president, also dominating the other ministers from the other parties. Bouterse, when he was elected as president, he was president between 2010 and 2020. He very much operated as a presidential president, but also he could also do that because his party was by far the largest one in the government, only supported by one or two very small parties.
So I suppose it's about the amount of personal loyalty that the president has that enables them to do that.
Yeah, it's a matter of personal loyalty. It's a matter of the power balance, I would say, within the government.
Hmm.
And it's a personality issue as well. Because Bouterse, well, also as a military leader, was used to concentrate a lot of powers into his own hands. So he basically continued that style of leadership when he was president, democratically elected president.
Hmm. Okay, yeah. Well, this has all been very interesting. So, I suppose to finish us off, could you tell us a fun fact about Suriname for our listeners to go about their days with?
Yeah, I can, and that is that Suriname, in contrast to what you would perhaps expect from a former Dutch colony, people drive on the left, and the reason is
Oh,
that it was also very briefly occupied by the United Kingdom, and in that period, driving on the left was introduced. But it's very confusing to people from the Netherlands visiting Suriname or vice versa to change the side of the road on which they are driving.
that does sound quite difficult, especially if, yeah, there's quite a long kind of distance between the two, so you don't get that instant. Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it. This has been really interesting. It's been great to hear what you have to say about Suriname and its elections. And yeah, thank you very much.
Great, thanks a lot.
Thank you for listening to the Observations podcast. This has been hosted by Democracy Volunteers. I've been Matt Davis, your special international elections correspondent for the Observations podcast. Thank you for listening.
The Observations podcast has been brought to you by Democracy Volunteers, the UK's leading election observation group. Democracy Volunteers is non-partisan and does not necessarily share the opinions of participants in the podcast. It brings the podcast to you to improve knowledge of elections, both national and international.